professional editor, and I've always wanted to expand my horizons by talking to other editors and sound designers, music composers, visual effects supervisors, essentially all the magicians who silently and invisibly work behind the scenes. This series is an attempt to make the invisible artists visible. I hope you enjoy the conversations.
Hi, and welcome to the Finest Cut. My guest today is a very, very well known post producer, Mithun D'Souza. Mithun, welcome to my podcast, and so good to finally be able to have this chat with you.
Yeah, thanks, Antara. Thanks for having me here today, man. I mean, I've been watching some of the episodes that you put out, and I've been excited to actually have this conversation. Thank you.
Likewise. Mithun, to begin with, I wanted to know from you. So, post producers and post supervisors have been a relatively new phenomenon in the film industry. I would say, I think the past 10 to 12 years has really seen this particular profile, become really strong in the post process. I want to know, how did you turn to post supervision?
It surprises me every day that I've ended up doing this. But I mean, to touch upon what you asked, you're right to say that the profile itself has come about only in the last 10 to 15 years. I think there's always been a need for people to kind of help bridge or try and make sense of a very, very, collaborative effort, which is what we do, right? In filmmaking, you have 300 plus people who don't usually meet on the next project, coming together to put across, something that was presented to them as an idea at a script level, and to bring it to life and put it on video. I mean, capture it on, some form of video, and then compile it into a piece of art requires a whole bunch of freelancers to actually collaborate to make that happen. And there are various roles that are predetermined in the process. Some are technically driven, some are creatively driven, and some are management driven. And this role did end up becoming a need of the hour, primarily to help streamline a process that spans a whole bunch of teams. And, because it's post-production, you usually aren't required to be there on set or on in front of the camera, especially if you're ending up, shooting on film. So all those processes were earlier managed by a laboratory, and, that just because the nature of how our medium worked, the laboratory used to handle a whole bunch of these processes, right from dailies reviews to, pushing out transcodes or, digitizing of material for editing. If you go back to when it wasn't digital, even splicing reels together as rushes for people to view at the end of the day. All of those processes were handled by a laboratory. And they had really technically sound people managing that process at a laboratory, which is why you didn't need, someone to actually coordinate all of these efforts at a larger scale. And also you have to bear in mind, back in the day, when I say back in the day, we're talking like it was Zamana ago, but say 10, 20 years ago, you didn't have, that many films requiring, heavy lifting work. It was, like I said, if lab was already allocated that job, they would end up processing the material and pushing it to, the various departments that needed access to it. And the sound and video labs usually were quite strong in their, capabilities to manage it. So this role came about primarily once the workload started to increase, and everything ended up becoming digital over the course of the last 10, 15 years. The need for coordination, management, and also just overviewing the entire process became more and more apparent. I myself, like all my peers, may or may not be directly trained for this activity. I actually, keep, referencing about, how open-ended our business is to non-technically trained talent. And that's something that I find admirable in our business, actually. The fact that it's so open-ended to anyone who's willing to put in the effort and the time dedicated to a task to get better at it. So I ended up working for the longest time in my career in the technical positions at studios. So I worked at a couple of them in Bombay as well, just running their technical operations, and I gathered a lot of my knowledge base from there to actually migrate over to producing, which is something that I was quite keen on also doing parallelly. So I did spend some time producing some ad films and smaller run content before I combined the two, and that was always the plan, to combine the two and see how we can try and help bridge the divide between production and post. And because I come from a technical background, it helped me bridge that divide a little better, in my opinion, just being fair to all the processes that were involved. So this, I mean, to just circle back to your question, the role became more and more the need of the hour just because of how many, departments there actually were working concurrently on the process, and to try and meet the ever evolving timelines and the uncertainties that exist in our business. And yeah, primarily as a post producer and a post supervisor or a coordinator. I mean, these titles are quite ambiguous in our business, at least. So I'll, I mean, not cover, how the differentiation occurs. But no matter what role you play in this business, the work expectation is the same, right? The work expectation that you have from a post supervisor, coordinator, producer is to just help you manage post production of your project in the most effective way, like an EP would for production. Their roles, begin and end primarily with production in our country, but they also migrate themselves over to post production just to overview everything. And they hand over that process to a post supervisor or a post producer, just to take that off their shoulders and to manage it in a more technically sound way. So that's how it came about, in my opinion.
Right. Also, as you said, you're kind of bridging the gap between the various processes. Mithun, can you take me through when you've taken up a project, for instance? I also know that you're very selective about which projects you pick up and who are the people you choose to collaborate with. So, sure. Just tell me how and on what basis you're making these choices.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's an interesting question to ask somebody who's into the management of projects, because usually you're not given that luxury to choose, projects that you want to associate with. I mean, I've been fortunate. I'll be very honest with you. I find myself in an extremely fortunate position to, be at the right place at the right time. I think that plays a crucial role in any form of work in our business. But being in the right place at the right time, you also need to have the skill set to, cover the work expectation in some form or the other. So what I've been able to do in terms of actually picking or choosing projects, I don't know how many I've actually been able to pick and choose, but at least the ones that materialized. The way I would actually approach it is quite simple, right? Because it's a collaborative process, I feel you need to figure if you're going to be comfortable working with the core group of people that you're going to be, interacting with through the project. For a post producer or a post supervisor, the life cycle of a project is between a year to year and a half. Unlike, let's say, 6 months to 8 months for an editor, or 4 or 5 months for a sound guy, or whatever. The time period that you're engaged on that project and that you're going to be dealing with people is significantly longer. And if you're not having a good time vibing with the people that you're vibing with, you kind of get that impression upfront. And I think this is true for all talent that is on our projects. Like if you're not like feeling it when you're going to meet them for the first time, you're probably thinking to yourself, hey, do I really want to do this or not? Yeah. Having said that, if I was just starting my career, I'd probably be a little more lenient of the vibe and more, driven by the fact that I need to get more work on my profile. So I think there's a good balance between the two. It also depends on how, hungry you are, at what stage of your career you are in. For you to be, running at 100 kilometers per hour or just 30 kilometers per hour. The work you end up doing might be the same. It's just that hustle changes, I think. So For me, a very crucial aspect is just interaction. Like if I'm not having a good time interacting with them, I kind of turn the other way and I give them some excuse or the other.
Yeah.
For all the producers that are going to watch this, I haven't done this with you guys. This is just something that I'm saying to Antara. But the thing is, you have to come up with some reason not to do the project. But for the ones that you actually choose, it's a great experience because you're starting off on a great foot, right? I mean, we also met working on projects together, and we've had such a good time working with one another that I can't think of, I mean, the doubt, nothing comes to my mind when I have to think about doing a project with you guys. And that's reaffirming the fact that, if you know what you're doing and you're doing a relatively decent job, then you wouldn't have a problem doing that same thing with the set with at least the same type of people for a long time. And being in our business, you need to be a little more patient. You need to be a little more easygoing. You need to learn how to read the room. You need to, not always react, but you need to respond. All those things are skill sets that are unheard of in our business. I mean, nobody speaks about them openly because, you might have, I mean, think about it. Like a director might have gone to war for 80 odd days. He or she is fully, like completely depleted of energy. And then they come to post production. You don't want a hyperactive person, panicking all the time, giving them unnecessary stress that that they shouldn't be dealing with. So a lot of how we do our projects is to just lay back and let everything flow, provided they have the trust and faith in us that we know what we're doing. And if that is accomplished, then it's a great experience through that term period. We rarely have challenges that we want to overcome through that period. I'm having said that, there's no doubt in my mind that there have been projects where we've had to whatever kind of course correct midway or try a different technique of managing that project, but that's part of the business. So those are my few criterias: money and whatever availability and all that comes secondary. I think for me, at least on a personal level, I find that because it's so collaborative, you need to have people that are extremely collaborative in their workflows themselves, and the fact that they are open to having conversations regularly. Like one other thing that I want to touch upon is I believe in transparency through and through the value system. So I do not believe in holding back any information. I mean, especially in a collaborative space where 300 or 400 people who don't know one another are coming together, right? You need to be as transparent as you can. So being that way requires that the other person on the other end reciprocates that transparency as well. So I find that quite convenient with the people we've made working relationships with. I mean, they respect the fact that we bring a certain professionalism to the work that we do, and we've been able to, manage some projects for them. Yeah.
Yeah, and I do feel because, as you said, we worked on projects together, and I've seen that the way in which you're dealing with the director, and kind of giving them the validation of their, having worked through this crazy shoot schedule, and
Yeah.
yet also kind of managing deadlines and schedules while allowing the creative team to do their thing. So that I felt very strongly through some of the projects that we've worked on. Tell me, how early on do you start sort of collaborating and communicating with the director and the other people, the other creative people?
Yeah, I mean, I can cover a little bit on how that process evolved as well. Because, like you mentioned, it's only been about 10, 15 years that people have been actively doing this as a profile per se. So for people who have the trust and faith in somebody to be able to manage that process, requires some amount of learning and warming up to. So I mean, that's the prelude to what I'm going to say next. So if you already had the understanding and you've had a good experience deploying such a workflow on your project, you would end up engaging with, let's say, a post supervisor or a post producer way early on in pre-production. Although, the title itself is post-based, I think like any HOD that would contribute towards the finished product, you bring them in at a planning stage as opposed to a finishing stage. And that's absolutely crucial if you're doing it with an executive producer who's influencing decisions about, production, that migrates through post production as well. I mean, in the digital era, you can't but help mitigate a lot of these conversations early on, because you don't want to be thrown up. You don't want to be thrown with a huge bunch of surprises after you're done. Spending all those bucks doing it in production, right? So while the term "fix it in post" is done to death, a lot of us are trying to educate or trying to bring about a change in the business where people are able to actually plan it in pre-production as opposed to fixing it in post. So a lot of the planning that has been done in the past is completely based on conversation, right? So once an editor is brought on board, or once a cinematographer is brought on board, or once a music director is brought on board, the larger requirements of the project are debated and deliberated upon and discussed upon. Some of these, like I said, could be technically driven, and a majority of them are creatively driven. But having those conversations early on allows both the planning commission, let's call them that, the executive production team, or the line production team, and the post production team, it gives them enough arsenal to make a lot of the assumptions that are required to be made for both budgeting and scheduling tasks. And the more details that are furnished upfront, the better the planning and the understanding of the processes. And a lot of the problems that are generated in our processes, at least with post production, is like we were saying earlier on the call, either due to bad planning or underestimation of timelines or budgets.
Yes, totally.
And that part is something that we try and influence some change if we are brought in early, and that kind of detailing helps just a whole bunch of processes streamline themselves. And I truly believe that for that task to be accomplished successfully with the least amount of problems, having people in the pipeline who are able to mitigate those problems just allows you that flexibility to have a project that runs extremely successfully and smoothly. So on our projects, we do end up being asked to come in early, but there are times when we've been handed a budget and told, work backwards towards it. And I've worked across the value chain, with extremely tiny projects with really small monies to pretty decently sized projects with enough money allocated to them, to know why those systems exist, because you can't always have a set budget for a set task, at least in our country, given that we don't have that clear cut, what do you call them, like we don't have clear cut markers saying this is an indie production and this is a studio production. We don't have that system in our country. We don't have a studio funded project versus a indie production to say, okay, on this one, these are the the union rates that you pay for this task versus that task. So we all end up being quite flexible with our allocations, I would say, which is why those budgets are sometimes not relevant. I've been fortunate to be a part of really, really tiny productions that have gone on to do extremely well in their runs in the theaters or whatever. But also on the other end, been part of really big projects that have tanked on the first day and not ended up doing well. So the budgets are only relevant to who's putting up that money, how much money you have to spend on a production and how much time you have to spend on the production. But we do try and influence that change. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I feel, this is a reference to what we were talking about before I started recording. But frequently I find the amount of time, the quantum of time that we are asked to commit is here. the budget that in post that we are being offered, I think across the board, is somewhere here. And somewhere along the way, there is the director's expectations of what they would expect from that particular crew member. So I'm sure these are also things that come your way, right? When you're trying to negotiate the budget.
Yeah. So I have a unique task actually at hand when I'm called for a production, right? So first of all, I have to negotiate my own monies, which is something that if you don't have a precedence for, it gets really tricky to do because you're then being compared to other people that are offering their services
Yeah,
exactly
that's
like you are.
yeah,
So
that comparison
this
is, I think, everyone's favorite. Yeah.
yeah, this problem that we are discussing today exists across the value chain, and I'm pretty sure it goes all the way up till the director and the producer who's called you for that meeting. Right? It's not something that only we are contending with. I mean, I'm saying the size of the problem might be different, but the problem is universal. So when the director goes to sell his project, the first question he's asked by investors is who's the actor that's associated with your project. They don't care about the fact that it's a great script or otherwise, and that's the sad part about the business that we are in, unfortunately. Right? Luckily there is some change that is being driven, thankfully, to some super successful work that's coming out of some places in South India, some in the Northeast, and they are able to really push the boundaries in terms of storytelling, which is what movies are meant to be, as opposed to what mainstream, I would say mainstream Bollywood or mainstream, cinema is defined like in our country. So it's unfortunate that, directors who have great scripts or writers who have great scripts will not have access to the kind of monies that they need to put a project together, that really needs the kind of collaboration from, very talented uh, collaborators, right from all the technical fields, I would say, because an actor didn't budge on his fee or whatever, right? So that's the unfortunate part. But luckily for me, because I'm able to suss that out while I'm negotiating my own monies to be a part of that project or not, it helps me kind of direct a lot of those conversations upfront, right? I'm able to at least have those conversations and tell them, hey, you know what? Maybe you're not looking at it the right way, or maybe you're not considering all the parameters that you could consider while you're budgeting for this production. And luckily, just because of the rapport that we've been able to generate with the producers that we're working with, we've been offered that flexibility, saying, why don't you just do this for us? So I'm able to then, kind of make assumptions on my peers' parts. That is, for all departments, I'm able to at least have a more fair representation. When I say fair representation, I'm also going in with the assumptions that I'm making. But I believe that having spent the time working in our business, if I know, like if I'm interacting more with the post production crews, I have info directly from them in terms of what kind of monies they charge, how their workflows are set up, what are the timelines that they are comfortable working in, what are the teams that they work with, what are their strengths and weaknesses, to be able to kind of play a balancing act of sorts, trying to find the most effective way of putting it all together. So like most often than not, if we are extremely collaborative during the budgeting and scheduling phase with the EPs, then I can have flexibility on, let's say, the larger number and how it is divided across the project, as opposed to being told, no, we have only this certain number for this line item. That becomes slightly more trickier, especially in a country like ours, where package deals or whatever you want to call them are the norm. Like, you don't have anyone who's actually ending up being paid by the month or the week or whatever at a HOD level. And that's unfortunate, because time is what at the end of the day, there are only two services that we all are selling, right? We're selling our time and our ability to discern what the team wants from us and deliver it. And both are correlated. Like, you can't just say you have unending time or unending money. And I think that that change is being driven, and it's unfortunate that it only got driven for 2 years thanks to a few OTTs that established themselves in our country and are no longer, pushing the boundaries, at least in terms of establishing standards. You can see it taking a downturn back to how television was being run for the longest time.
Precisely. Yeah.
So, I mean, and again, I'm not saying, and this means no disrespect to how television is run. It's just that, that's a different ecosystem, right? You're selling airtime. Like if you don't have that many hours of content being played out, the advertising model that they're operating on doesn't function. Versus, let's say, what's happening in the film or the OTT space, they're completely different models. They're not ad generated models. They are subscription generated or other revenue models, and I'm not an expert on them. But I would imagine that the metrics work differently. But to apply television metrics here is weird. But I'm hoping that the standards still gets pushed further up, as opposed to going back to the dark ages.
Yeah, because and again, this is something that I think we've discussed so often. There seems to be a different way of assessing how to pay above the line crew or even crew that's on shoot.
Yeah.
For instance, spot boys or hairdressing teams, hair and makeup teams, who are paid per diem and are paid way more than what I think most of us make in post production.
Yeah.
Despite a lot of us having put in years and years, which is not to say they have not put in years of training, but there is a certain skill that we are bringing to the post process as well. So how there seems to be this sort of disregard for the post process in general, and therefore we kind of get entrapped in that general disregard. How has do you feel that is also something that you are having to kind of navigate through?
I mean, constantly, I can't even tell you how much of a challenge it is to, ask for, I mean, just fair treatment at large, right? So it's unfortunate that, these processes have not been, what do you call it, not been sunshine to a large extent in terms of the contributions that they make towards the finished product. And it's only because, like I said, the the evolutionary path for most people working in post production today is unfortunately not that old. I mean, if you worked in a lab, I can swear by this because having spent some time in some labs, I know how much of a how much of a role they played in the early days of being in the early days of actually shooting on film, being processed and then finished in film. I know, how much of a trust they had to generate with these labs to actually see the project through. So they were almost as essential a part of the process as, let's say, a cinematographer or even a director for that matter of fact, because you just needed, and because it was extremely scientific process, everyone couldn't do it. It's not like, you download, resolve, press 4 buttons and you get a render at the end of it, right? You needed to understand how to mix chemicals. You needed to understand how to actually, and a lot of this was taught in film school, at least erstwhile. So I think that part of the process just, there was an exponential growth in terms of how that industry opened up to people post the digital era. And that, I think that plays a very pivotal part in terms of how our contributions are getting more and more diluted. Because if you look at it, the systems on set haven't changed for 100 years. You still have, like you said, spot boys, gaffers, all extremely valuable contributors to the process on set who are still there even if you're shooting digitally. There is absolutely no part of that system that has changed, right? You still have an enormous amount of people standing around waiting for cut to be called so that they can get to work, and you still have the same number of people contributing behind the camera there. But in post production, suddenly the amount of people that are actually involved has, I won't say doubled down, but the number of people just extended quite a bit. to include a whole bunch of other people. Now, what happened in that process, I think, is that earlier you would talk to maybe about 20, 30 odd people in post production, and you knew how to manage their expectations in some way or the other. But now, our team strengths are almost as large, but if you include the VFX teams, they are maybe, 500 times the size of what
Yeah.
production teams are.
Yeah, even
So,
edit teams, like if you
edit
have
teams,
what we did with Delhi Crime 2, for instance, we
yeah,
had such a large team because we were
working.
like multiple editors. Yeah.
And that part of that process, right, is for the producers also to understand that we are actually contributing that much more. So earlier, if you were taking decisions on, let's say, story, or changing narratives or whatever, you are only doing that at the end of the process once everything came together. Here you're having cuts or lineups presented to you the next day, right? And that's the benefits of having a digital process in this case. But the pitfalls of it is the pay scales haven't kept up because, of course, we're contributing that much more, but the value that we're generating is not being accounted for. So I think that value proposition, like, that's something that is an extremely challenging fight, especially because people need to understand the value. And as long as there are cheaper, faster, or more effective alternatives available, people will always pivot to that. And I see that happening already. Like I told you, if you look at the OTT guys, when they came to India, they wanted to bring in a lot of, professionally driven metrics and processes to the system. In my opinion, it failed miserably because, of course, nobody is able to back that up with actual, long-term sustainability. They've come and disrupted the way everything has happened, and for the better. But how do you sustain that? Like, that's not something that they had the foresight to actually uh, plan out. So in such a case, having these honest conversations with producers, explaining to them. And again, I don't know why this sounds like we're targeting the producers. They are also working for a budget that's been handed to them, I feel. But having these honest conversations and explaining to them why these things are the way they are, and getting them to see the value that is getting driven in is very important. Because we go back to those days when things were done over 6 months or 8 months, and you turn that in 8 months later, and you realize, wait a minute, dude, this is not working, or we need to redo a whole bunch of things. That's going to cost them 10x or 20x of what it would cost them today to rectify. So that value is important to pay attention to. And yeah, but on the other side, the timelines are getting shorter. So I that's another expectation that's unheard of. Like, I don't know who is planning these things or how they are planning it, but if they took advice from people that actually are on the ground doing it and helping make those assumptions, it would just be a much better system to manage. Like, you don't go to, I mean, if you don't go to a guy like Christopher Nolan and tell him, मेरे को परसों इंसेप्शन चाहिए, then you can't say that for any other project either. That's because it takes time to sit with Hans Zimmer, and you're letting him do his thing, and then you're letting the editor do their thing, and then you're coming up with what they make as their project. So I don't see why it should be any different to our systems, where they just need to allow people the time and flexibility to do their best job. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree. And definitely, I mean, it's not about targeting one, entity or so. It's just that because there's such a disparity is what is, one is really questioning. A DOP, for instance, who's involved for what, 40 odd days or 45 odd days on a feature, and then a few days of DI, for instance, is getting paid practically double of what an editor is making. And I'm talking about really well established editors. So I think that is one part of the problem for sure. The other, I think, where the responsibility is ours is that with the OTT era, there have been a lot of new opportunities for newer editors to go independent. And therefore, there also, I feel there's a tendency to quote lower because you're getting that first break much faster. So I think in that capacity, that is probably the onus is on us.
Without a doubt, and I just want to second what you're saying, right? So the DPs have been able to actually rally together because there are only that many of them. You have to understand that the number of people, the barrier to entry for a cinematographer is far higher than, let's say, the barrier to entry for anyone else on set, right? So for them, they are able to establish that ground rule in terms of their pay scales because they're paid by the day. Just can you, I can't even imagine a DP agreeing to a package deal saying, take as many days as you want because literally when you're not shooting a film or a series, they're shooting commercials. So for them, every day counts. Like it should for all of us. And I'm with you on this. Like I don't see why it should be any different to any of us. But like I said, because the barrier to entry to be a cinematographer is so high, because you're trusting that one person to be able to capture, let's say, one day of shoot was 20 odd lakhs. You set up an action sequence, blah, 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 blah. You're trusting that one guy to know how to do exposure, one guy or girl, sorry, I don't mean to be sexist, but you're trusting that one person to be, able to do their job successfully to your satisfaction so that you can translate that into post production. If you're thinking of that process to be that crucial, let me ask you, like I'm throwing this question back to you, right? And this is only because I've had so many cinematographers reach out to me through my career for advice on how to manage this digital process in a certain way. How crucial does my job become then to that process if I tell them to press the wrong buttons and then
Yes.
the results end up being extremely disappointing, not only for themselves but also for the directors or the producers. I mean, I've had instances where I've walked into other like I used to work for a particular bunch of studios in the business here, and I used to run their technical operations for them. So it was literally, and I'm happy to admit this on camera, that it was literally, I could be, whatever, taken to court because I was going beyond my contract to help people from other studios do the right, processes to actually bring their material to the standards that were being expected by the cinematographer. So in that situation, what should I be paid then? Would be the question that I've asked these DPs. Like I'll ask them, wait a minute. So if I didn't tell you that this is the way to do it, and you had to learn it your own way, what would be the outcome? And I've realized, and this is absolutely true about all the departments that we represent in post production. If, for example, you're stuck with somebody who's not contributing both on the technical and the creative front, right? You'll end up most often not with a mediocre result, right? And you'll end up thinking to yourself, wait, there's something not working here. I'm not too sure what it is, but someone needs to make sense of it all, right? And that part, in my opinion, is where the value driving aspect comes into play. Like I'm able to at least command that and tell, my producers, because I have the technical backing to actually allow me that flexibility. I'm able to tell them, just shut up, you don't know what you're talking about. Let me manage it. I don't know, how many other people will want to do that because they'll want to get the next job from them, or they'll
Yeah.
have their own reasons for it. But secondly, also to drive that quality. I mean, you gave an example of Delhi Crime season 2. Like I know there are a bunch of things that we've done in Delhi Crime to actually get it to the level that it's at today. And I know what it would have also been had we not done those things, having been an integral part of the production, just like you have. So I think from that aspect, we do all need to rally together to push for the standardization. I mean, another aspect that I keep talking about to all my producer friends is the what about residuals, right? Like, why are we not considered for? And I know I'm far lower on the value chain than, let's say, you know, really highly contributing HODs like, editors or background composers or sound designers. But I'm just saying, like, if you think of the larger aspect of the film, there's so many parts that go through all of us. And for the fact that we are only being told, Acha, you do your job and then you're done with it, seems a little ridiculous because if not for us being a part of that process, it would have turned out a different way. Better, worse, there's no questioning that. That's subjective, right? But the fact that it had turned out differently means that we contributed towards that process. So I'm not too sure why, some departments like music are able to command that. I'm not too sure why, some other departments are able to command that. Like, I used to work in the ad space, and the guys that everyone envied across the entire system were voiceover artists. Because they made more money than everyone else in the room. So it's weird that, some people are able to rally together because the substitution is not that easy for those departments, vis-a-vis with cinematography that you mentioned. And you can apply the same metrics to voiceover artists, right? How many people can be great voiceover artists? Like, we can all try, but there are only a few of us that will crack it. So that's why they were able to rally together and, have that standardization, in my opinion. And if you can get it to happen industry-wide, that's a great first start. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that is, I feel still, by the looks of it, it's still going to take more time. Uh, because, and I think it's very tricky because everyone, personally, I feel, and particularly through the pandemic, I did realize that everyone comes from different economic situations. So if someone has to take a project, regardless of, okay, not being industry standard payment, they have to do it because they have a family to look after or whatever. And also, speaking of the pandemic, and because we spoke of Delhi Crime, Mithun, that was, I think, such an unprecedented situation that all of us landed up in. And we had just started the edit of Delhi Crime season 2 when the pandemic hit. I think we just got like one physical sitting each with the director. Um, and what was interesting for me was the way you worked around that situation. And our director Tanuj had to go back to LA. And the way you kind, we had our music composer was also not in India. The three editors were in their different separate homes. Can you just let's talk about the various tools, that the remote working tools that you introduced through the course of that edit?
Sure. I mean, it's fascinating to me also that we were able to pivot and, make something out of all the projects that we've delivered through the pandemic, actually. So I've been fortunate. I'll be very honest with you. A lot of what we've done, in the couple of years that the OTT guys have been active here has been, possible, at least for me on a personal level, thanks to the teams that I work with, right? And again, it comes back to the point that I made earlier, that if you're all not easygoing and if you're all not able to just calm down and, operate at the levels that we can operate at, this wouldn't be as successful as it is. So I truly believe that I'm only as good as the teams that I work with. And luckily for me, I have a great team working with me. I mean, I'm super fortunate that the people that have decided to back me up and, be a part of my core team at least, have been super efficient at what they do. So huge shout out to, finding the right people and working with them, because that's the need of the hour. I mean, you need to be as shanti and stress free as you can be while you're trying to mitigate all these things. So to touch upon the remote tools though, we came from a little bit of learning with the first wave, where we actually delivered about 3 projects, the only 3 projects that made their way out in our country during that pandemic. And this was something that was new to us as well. So a whole bunch of tools that were already available to us as a disposal were what we deployed on all our productions, not just Delhi Crime. So some of the tools actually enabled a little bit of collaboration because, like you mentioned, our director had to go back. Our cinematographer was based in LA as well. Our colorist was based in Dubai. Our music composer was based again somewhere north of California itself. And, you guys were in Bombay. So a whole bunch of things needed to be brought together on one platform to at least, talk to one another and whatnot. So we relied heavily on some tool sets like Evercast and Pix and, Google Meet and Zoom were our backbone for most things. But a lot of productions, not just ours, Antara, across the world actually migrated to a very remote workflow. And that's something that, has happened and has happened super successfully, in my opinion, because now you're able to actually dedicate, qualified time to a task, achieve it, and then move on, as opposed to spending countless hours in a room trying to do something that would generate a result over consistent periods of time. So I think that remote workflow has been beneficial. If you look up these tools, you'll notice that most of them allow for conversation, presentations, and we work in a visual medium. So for audio visual medium, sorry. But if you notice, most of these tools will allow you to collaborate across that workflow. So with Evercast, for example, you're able to present to a screen simultaneously, viewing it on your own setup as well, and talking through your edit like you normally would. Pix has been something that we have access to on most of our productions for that specific OTT, and those guys actually allow for concurrent playback as well. There's another great tool that we use in finishing that we didn't use in editorial called Sync Sketch, which is another tool that we use for annotations and whatnot for VFX. So all these tools just enabled us to function like we normally would have if we were in the room together. And that's the biggest point, right? Because it's so collaborative, you want to be in a room together. And that's what we're doing today as well. We are just on this Zoom call in a room together, you and I having this conversation. So as long as we kept that collaboration going, it was quite effective. But on the back end, nobody knows what kind of challenges we went through, synchronizing drives, making sure they were deployed on the right time, making sure that the files reached their location at the right time, making sure that it was all kept up to date, because a lot of things kept changing. We had new material come in. We had like lots of stuff going on that production that was quite challenging.
Yeah, and also actually, I think in India particularly, one of the biggest challenges is stable internet.
Yeah.
So that was, I think, through the pandemic, because we did Shakuntala also,
Yeah.
and with Delhi Crime also, there was this internet was a perennial problem. But you feel this, and this is, I think, since the pandemic, there's been a conversation about, say, Zoom meetings, for instance, or, that why do we need to kind of travel and if we can do this meeting can happen on Zoom, or why do we need to sort of work with a director in one room when we can use these remote editing tools. I want to get some a perspective from you on this.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a firm believer that as long as collaboration can take place and be successful, the medium doesn't matter, right? I mean, I've had, luckily, I've played different roles through my career, and I've been able to successfully deploy almost all my skill sets without the proximity being a factor. And that's something that I genuinely believe allows you more flexibility to deploy your time more effectively, and also, make sure that, nothing is suffering on the other end, right? So that's why the crucial thing to take away from what I'm saying is the collaboration is not suffering. If that's the case, the medium is honestly second nature. Like, it really doesn't matter if you're in a room or otherwise. Some people just don't like this. Like, they can't deal with the fact that we're doing this online because you can't read the room, or you don't know what the vibe is, you don't know what is being said, or whatever. There's a little bit of awkwardness when it comes to doing this online for some people. And while some other people enjoy it thoroughly because at least they don't have to deal with that person sitting behind them and whatever, hounding them with their presence. So I think there's merit, and there is some amount of awkwardness to overcome. I've never felt it personally, because a lot of the work that we doesn't actually require us to be interacting directly with people. At least the people we are interacting with are not necessarily the people that are spending the most amount of time with HODs, right? Or with the people that are taking creative decisions. So for us, it's far more flexible to have these interactions online. But for you guys, I do understand why it could be a challenge for you to be working with a director that is uncomfortable with this process, or comfortable. I mean, it could go both ways. Some editors might just hate the fact that they have to work online and would like to sit with for director and just hash it out over one interaction. So that's actually, it's very unique to each team that we've worked with. Having said that, I have a point to make here about why I think this is the future and why I do think that, warming up to this idea is a good thing for most people. And I like to, you know, give the example of the one film that I think, took everyone by surprise, at least in 2021. And, it just blew up for what they were able to accomplish for all the things that we've spoken about today. And it can apply it to every single department. And that's this film called Everything Everywhere All at Once, right? So if you end up watching it, and please go watch it. We're taping this right when it's released in Bombay as well, luckily, in the theater. So if you haven't seen it, plug for that film. But if you actually watch that film, whenever you end up getting access to it, you'll realize that they've actually done exactly what we've done, right? During the pandemic, they've gone and shot a film, finished it entirely, almost entirely remotely. You should look up the behind the scenes if you haven't already. And, they've ended up with such an incredible product because it started off, of course, with really fun people, and you'll get that vibe across all the interviews that you'll watch of these guys. Really fun people trying to put a really fun project together and being extremely skilled at the task that they've been assigned to. That's all that it was. I mean, every single department has aced it. And in my opinion, if they were able to do that, I mean, this is the biggest film that came out last year in 2021, according to what a lot of the critics are calling out for that year's release, right? If they're able to do that during the pandemic, there is absolutely no barrier to entry, at least when it comes to collaborating that way for any project, right? And you'll see that with all the newer titles that are getting released right now, whether it's, the blockbuster that Amazon is putting out, which is The Ring of Fire, that was also shot through the second wave and whatnot, or even if you look at the new Game of Thrones series. And that's what I'm trying to say, that if they were all able to collaborate that way remotely, then there's some value to exploring this remote collaboration and, remote working tools. By the way, a cool tidbit that I learned about was the entire visual effects, which I thought was incredible in Everything Everywhere All at Once, were done by 7 people, dude, out of which one was a supervisor. So you can only imagine what the power of collaboration has actually yielded. So yeah, a lot of things to learn from this whole new world that we're working in. And the other advantage that it allows you is that it allows you the flexibility of space and time, right? So I could be working with some talent that is based out of, I don't know, Poland, for example, for Foley, just because location doesn't matter then, right? They could be working with us, like I've got 4 calls for productions, and they were expecting me to manage post for them sitting out of Bombay for productions that were happening in Africa. I got like 2 calls from Africa, 1 from UK. It's weird, but I see no problem in doing it. If you have the network and you have the flexibility to actually deploy it, why not? I didn't personally have the time to do it because we had already signed up a couple of projects. But the fact that I even received those calls was ridiculous. I found it ridiculous. I was like, what, you want me to do this from Bombay? And they're like, yeah, why not? So it's fun to explore this new medium, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's, I truly echo that sentiment, Mithun. I think with remote working, there's a whole new range of, with everything as always has its pros and cons, but I think this is a whole new kind of range of work that we can kind of look at. And I want to thank you, Mithun, for taking out your time. We've been, I think, talking for almost an hour now. Yeah.
It doesn't feel like an hour.
It doesn't feel like
hardly a couple of
yeah. But thank you, because this has been so really enlightening for me personally as well, to understand what you are experiencing as a post producer. And yeah, I hope everyone who's watching is also able to take home, whatever we've discussed and think about it, and hopefully apply it to their work as well.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Mithun.
Thank you, Antara.
If you enjoyed this video, then please like it, share it, comment on it, and subscribe to this channel so you're tuned in for our upcoming episodes.